Chris. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, and sorry for the challenges here, but we're glad that you've stuck with it. So you are true history lovers, so we appreciate you. So my name is Todd Kleismit. I serve as the Executive Director for America 250 Ohio. And Chris Hurtubise is going to do her best to shepherd some more people in with us. So again, can't thank you enough for joining us. This is our third episode of Ohio and the Revolution. We've wanted to explore, what was happening in and around the Ohio country, leading up to and then after the American Revolution. Although Ohio wasn't a state, there was plenty happening around here. And so we're going to talk a bit more about that tonight. So episode 1 focused on what the Ohio country looked like about in the 18th century. Episode 2 was in May, and some of you may have been with us when we discussed how the region that we now call Ohio was a shared space managed by the Shawnees, the Wyandots, Miamis, Delawares, Seneca Cayugas, and others. We discussed a wide range of changes underway in the Ohio country then, the influence of people like George Crone and the town known as Pickawillany, and why it was important locally and internationally. Tonight, we're joined by 3 panelists with expertise in the period of history we'll discuss tonight. That is the period of the French and Indian War and other conflicts in the Ohio country. So joining us tonight are Dr. Brandon Downing from Marietta College, Tammi Shrum, Site Director of Historic Zoar Village and Fort Laurens, Jim Lee, who is a member of the Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma and the Cherokee Nation. Dr. Brandon Downing focuses on early American history, particularly Native white relations along the frontier. He has taught courses in colonial America, American Revolutionary Era, Native American history, and public history. As part of the Ohio Humanities Speakers Bureau, he gives talks on the Northwest Territory, the War of 1812, and the role Marietta played in the development of the new nation. His current book manuscript is Barbarous Tribes of Savages, Violence and Conflict on the Periphery of Empire in the Colonial Mid-Atlantic, 1750 to 1776. Tammi Shrum is the site director of Historic Zoar Village and Fort Laurens, and she has a passion for making history approachable and engaging for people of all ages. She was born and raised in Tuscarawas County and began her career as the site manager at J.E. Reeves Victorian Home and Carriage House Museum in Dover. She joined Historic Zoar Village in 2015. Tammi earned undergraduate degrees in history and anthropology from Kent State University and a master's degree in history from the University of Akron. Jim Lee grew up in Oklahoma and is a member of the Shawnee Tribe and the Cherokee Nation. Jim's 4th great-grandfather was Silver Heels, brother to Chief Cornstalk and Chief Nonhelema, who made their homes in much of Ohio during the mid to late 1700s. Jim and his wife Jeri have been researching their family's genealogies for over 40 years and started utilizing DNA studies in 2008. Jim received his double Bachelor of Science degrees in chemistry and biology from Northwestern Oklahoma State University. Jim switched his career path and worked in the oil and gas industry, then in Oklahoma and Texas as a chemist and manager for 40 years. Jim served as vice president of the inaugural Shawnee Tribe Historical and Cultural Preservation Committee and is a board member of the Shawnee Indian Mission Foundation and the chairman of their Cultural Outreach Committee. So now that we have introduced our panelists, I'm going to pass the baton over to Dr. Downing, who will tell us a little bit about what, Brandon, when you talk about this period of time, what do you think are important things for our audience to know about the French and Indian War and why it was so relevant to those who would later be part of Ohio? Brandon?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Thanks for those introductions as well. So happy to be here and the French and Indian War. So I think just to kind of kick it off is to kind of put it into perspective of being in the mid-18th century and what was going on in colonial America. So by this point, of course, the colonies are well established. And I see the French and Indian War as much as a demographic war as it was over land. The colonies had begun to fill up, and the need for more land really pushed the Europeans coming into the country further and further into the frontier. And so since we have three major empires in North America, the Spanish and French being the other ones, eventually once that space begins to fill up, obviously it comes into conflict with each other, and that launches into a series of wars known as the French and Indian Wars. So the colonists at the time called them the French and Indian Wars. It wasn't just this one war, although this is the most famous one because it has the most serious consequences to it, but there were a series of wars that occurred throughout the earlier part of the century that began to change ideas about what the empire meant and its significance to the British in particular. The Americans didn't really, they were involved in the previous wars, mostly on the periphery, but this is the one where they are fully engaged. And so probably that's why it's a little bit more well known than the other ones that come before it. In any case, we're probably familiar with the more traditional story of this desire for land, this competition between, squatters, fur traders, land speculators, converging in the Ohio Valley, and that's kind of what the French considered theirs. The Delaware, who I'm going to focus on today, also claimed this land. The Iroquois claimed this land. Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland. There are a whole host of entities that claim possession of this land. That's basically what sparks the 7 Years' War. But I think what I'm more interested in this time period is why the Ohio Valley, what brought the war there. And I think the best way to approach that is by looking at where the seeds were planted for this war. And that's where this begins in eastern Pennsylvania. So that's kind of where I want to start with this. So how do I move to the next slide? There we go. So looking at the Delaware, who were the primary natives dealing with the Pennsylvania government because their homeland was situated in what's known as eastern Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia, which you can see on the green map there to the lower left of the state of Pennsylvania, what becomes the state of Pennsylvania. But you can see that darker green area. That was primarily where the Delaware homeland or spiritual homeland was. And of course, William Penn and the Quakers arrived in just below there in Philadelphia. Relations have been pretty, in comparison, right? I mean, William Penn's still a colonizer, so you still have issues surrounding that. But relatively compared to other colonies, the relationship was pretty good in terms of the Delaware having a lot of control over their sovereignty in eastern Pennsylvania at this time. But things begin to change in 1737. And this is well after William Penn has died, and his sons now control Pennsylvania, and they put forward a land treaty that was it didn't exist. They claimed it existed, that William Penn had negotiated this during his lifetime. And since the need for land was not present during William Penn's lifetime, this was a treaty that was supposed to be carried out later in time, and it's fraudulent. It was totally created by Penn's children, and the Delaware knew it. But they because they had good relations with Pennsylvania, and because they had what they believed pretty decent relationship with William Penn, they said, okay, well, maybe there's a misunderstanding, and so they kind of allow the procedure to take place. And as you can see, this becomes known as the 1737 walking purchase. And this entire dark green area, then the kind of the larger map there that's beside it, which you can see at the very bottom of that line would be where Philadelphia is, at the very bottom. And then you can see there's kind of a darker line that kind of goes diagonally. And that's really up along the, it's supposed to be parallel with the Delaware River, but you can see it goes beyond that. And then the line that kind of goes parallel back to the Delaware River at its furthest point, at its apex, that was supposed to be the land claim, which was already fraudulent because the walk had already gone too far into the interior part of Pennsylvania. But what happens is the person who draws the map is going to draw the line parallel with the Delaware River, and you can see it goes all the way into kind of like this triangle. So they basically steal that land from the Delaware. The Delaware did not approve of this, and it brought a lot of conflict between them. The Pennsylvania government actually calls in Iroquois officials to enforce the treaty, which the Delaware, of course, don't appreciate at all. But ultimately, the result is, and the reason I'm spending so much time on this is because this is where, at least in my research that I look at, this is where the 7 Years' War seeds are planted, because of this turn in this relationship between the Delaware and Pennsylvania officials, and the Delaware being pushed out of their spiritual homeland into, as you can, if you look back kind of at the smaller map where you see that where it says Wyoming and Shamokin, that's where the Delaware moved into those areas. And so they hold a grudge, essentially, right? That they know that this land was fraudulent. They hold this grudge, and they're basically biding their time for revenge. So let's go to the next slide. And so you can see here, if you remember where Shamokin was, Wyoming Valley, and that green arrow where it says the Delawares. The Delawares are going to split into two. So the eastern Delawares will stay in Shamokin in the Wyoming Valley, and the western Delawares will cross, go across the Allegheny Mountains, and they'll eventually settle in a place known as Kittanning, which is just north of Pittsburgh, as you can see there on the map, Kittanning. And actually, what made me so interested in the Delaware is I grew up just outside Kittanning, and so that was always, as a child, I had great interest in that. And what happens is basically once they cross the Allegheny Mountains, is they have essentially entered into French territory, because the lines beyond the mountains they're not surveyed, and those lands are under great dispute, especially in southwestern Pennsylvania. And then you can see these blue arrows. These are fortifications that the French will build in the up and through the 1750s. And the reason they build those forts is because once the Delawares had crossed over into western Pennsylvania, well, the lucrative fur trade followed them. And I think that's probably what you guys covered in the last webinar with George Crone. He's one of the leaders in carrying the English, the colonial trade across the mountains and into Kittanning, because the Delaware were their customers. And once the Delaware left, the traders followed them. Well, the French considered this their territory, and they didn't appreciate English traders in their backyard, so they complained to French officials up in Montreal. And as a result, the French will try to reestablish their authority in the region by building fortifications. And so they build numerous ones that you go even further up, all the way up to Montreal. But you can see, I just kind of cut this down into Pennsylvania. And just in Pennsylvania and in southern New York, you can see there's already 4 fortifications built there. The largest construction will be the one at Duquesne, which is modern day Pittsburgh. Now, as they're building this fort, right, trying to reestablish their control, with the Delaware just north of that in Kittanning, and then of course the Virginians moving in from the south with George Washington, the more famous story of George Washington entering into the Great Meadows, coming into conflict with a delegation of French led by Jumonville, and of course Tanner Grierson, planting his tomahawk in the middle of Jumonville's forehead. And then George Washington retreating and building Fort Necessity will officially launch the war. But it's because the Delawares, with their grievances, leaving the treaty area in eastern Pennsylvania into the Ohio Valley, this is what brings this all together, right? The French are already there. The Virginians are moving into this area. There are competition to claims. Pennsylvania claims this land. Virginia claims this land, Maryland claims this land, the British claim this land, the French do, the Iroquois, and it just goes on and on and on. So you can see that this desire for this very lucrative land is going to bring conflict. And so really it's the Delaware who bring, I think, if you look at this on a larger scale, which I think if you bring up the next slide, if you kind of like zoom out, you'll see a larger picture of here with the empire. So you have the English, of course, who were expanding exponentially with population. That's why the demographics come into play here and the movement westward. The French, who had far less people but much more land, and you can see where that kind of battle mark is there in the Ohio Valley, is right on that line between the French and the English. So on a larger scale there, you can see where the empires are coming into conflict with each other, and the Delaware, the Iroquois, and of course, as you'll probably see from Jim later, Shawnee are kind of stuck in the middle. They get trapped in the middle of this. And so, the Indians are going to play their best card here, which is traditionally playing empires off of each other. And that's what the Delaware do here too, right? Whenever Braddock eventually makes his way into Western Pennsylvania, the Delaware under Shingas and Captain Jacobs are going to ask him, hey, if you win, what are you going to do with this land? And Braddock basically says, you're not getting it. And so they end up joining the French early in the war. And so that kind of sparks everything. So we can move to the next slide there. Right. And then again, I just bring this map up so you can see there's the Western Delaware, the Eastern Delaware. And then I have some critical points on here: Penns Creek, Great Cove, Paxton County. These all play. I'm not going to get too deep in this because this is more maybe Pennsylvania history. But in the 7 Years' War in Pennsylvania, these are strategic points that occur early in the war, 1755, 1756. And this allows the Delaware to regain a lot of the land that they had lost to squatters in particular, and of course to some treaties that were negotiated with the Iroquois over the heads of the Delaware in Pennsylvania, and they were able to regain some of that territory, and it allows them to negotiate a favorable treaty, 1758, for the Treaty of Easton, which temporarily give the Delaware exactly what they wanted, which we'll see on the next slide, what the Delaware were fighting for in the 7 Years' War. Or maybe not. I think this is one of those ones where you clicked it and then the next thing came up. So maybe it got lost in the process. But essentially, what comes up here would be maybe if you just move that map, or maybe it just didn't make it on there. I can just mention it real quick. That's fine. But anyways, what the Delaware are fighting for are a few things, and this is critical to the outcome of the war and what comes after. And that is, through the Treaty of Easton, what they tried to accomplish was they wanted to regain their seat at the table with Pennsylvania officials. They wanted to maintain their land, their sovereignty over their land, which they got in the Treaty of Easton, and they wanted to push away control by the Iroquois, who falsely claimed control over the Ohio lands, which was technically not theirs. But the Iroquois wanted to get under kind of the power of the Iroquois in that situation. So what this does is that basically the Treaty of Easton brings the Delaware out of the war, makes them a neutral participant at this point, and this allows. And suddenly, if you think about it, the point that the British begin to win is when the Delaware exit the war. Right? Once the Delaware had signed the treaty in 1758, that allows Forbes to build a road and defeat the French in Duquesne. And then, of course, the new strategies that occur with William Pitt transforms the 7 Years' War into a victory for the British ultimately. But it has a lot to do with the Delaware, who were undefeated. They had never lost a battle. Once they exited the conflict, the British then were able to win those battles along the frontier, especially in the Ohio Valley. And that, of course, will lead to 1763, which I think we'll cover a little bit later on, but eventually leads to events in 1763. But again, what happens in the 7 Years' War, what happens in the aftermath of that war, will lead into the interwar period that brings revolution. And so it's all connected on a bigger scale, but I'm going to give Jim and Tammi a chance to tell their stories, and then maybe at the end we can bring it all back together again. So thanks, Todd, for giving me that time, and look forward to hearing everyone else here.
Fascinating, Brandon. And boy, you covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. So thanks very much for that overview, Brandon. Yeah, we're going to do a little bit of a pivot here and go over to Jim Lee. As I mentioned before in the introduction, he has a lot of family ties to this period and with the Shawnee. So Jim has a presentation he's going to go over with us to tell things from the Native perspective here. So Jim.
Thanks, Todd. I appreciate the invite to join this, and looking forward to talking about my family. As you said, we've been doing Shawnee history and family history for over 40 years, and I was fortunate that much of my Shawnee family were prominent people, and so they were involved in all of this mess that happened, and so their names and things that most people don't have. And then along with that as well, have a lot of my European family that were involved in this is in the same manner, and so there was a lot of conflict between the two. And
Jim, are you able to turn your camera on?
it is on.
It is on. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Go ahead.
But I need my PowerPoint.
I think Chris will call that up here in just a moment.
Hello, Stephanie. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to describe my ancestors. Silver Heels is depicted on the left. He was my fourth great grandfather. He was a warrior and brother to Cornstalk, who's in the middle, who was the chief of the tribe at the time. And then Nonhelema was their sister, and she was also a chief and was involved in all kinds of things along with Cornstalk and Silver Heels. And one other chief that most people don't know, he was Shawnee and he was their brother, is Bakonga Helis, who is listed as a Delaware chief. And that's, people know him by that, but he was actually their brother. Next slide. During my DNA studies, a cousin and I had gathered a number of Shawnee tribal members together, and we did some DNA testing on quite a few. And turns out that our family's related to the Blue Jackets and the Tecumseh and Shawnee Prophet descendants. There's a lack of documentation, obviously, with all these people, but the DNA shows that we had a common ancestor somewhere, probably around Blue Jacket, and that was a interesting find. So it was not known by most of us. Next slide. So during the time before the French and Indian War, Brandon was talking about the trading that went on, and during this time, the Silver Heels, Cornstalk, and his mother and his sister actually traded a lot of buckskins and goods back and forth with the British and the French. And I happened to find in this book a listing of what they had sold to the British, and it has their names in it, and it also has Blue Jacket and Blue Jacket's brothers, and which is kind of unusual. This was at Lower Shawnee Town, which is now Portsmouth, Ohio, on the Ohio River. And so they did a lot of trading with them. And so it was kind of cool to find documentation like this. Next slide. One more. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Cornstalk. He was an uncle, great uncle. He was actually a peace chief and a civil chief. He belonged to the Makoche division, but he's also was a war chief. When there was times of war, he fought pretty mercilessly. They attacked villages and settlers in Virginia during the French and Indian War, and they would go in there and prepare to be friendly, and then at some point would just kill everybody. And the bad thing was the militia and the frontiersmen did the same thing to the natives. Chief Logan, a Mingo chief, was his family were killed at Yellow Creek. The same way, some frontiersmen were being friendly to the families, and then all of a sudden they just started killing them all. And Logan's family were all killed, his wife and his daughter, and then he went on the warpath later that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. But so also Cornstalk was an opponent of slavery, and anytime a freedom seeker might bump into them in the Ohio area, they would welcome them into the tribe. They would actually adopt them into the tribe, and they didn't like slavery, and so they came into the tribe, and they were adopted and became Shawnee essentially. Cornstalk led the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774, and then they lost that battle, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But he also negotiated the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, but then later was murdered at Fort Randolph. He went there on a peacekeeping visit to try and tell them that he couldn't keep his warriors from joining the British, and so it was just kind of a mix up there. They didn't like him. They didn't like what he was doing, and they ended up killing him and his son and another man at Fort Randolph, which was Point Pleasant. Next slide. So here's one of the attacks at Fort Upper Track during the French and Indian War. It was a fort. There were 22 people there. The Shawnee and Delaware went in there and attacked the fort, and they killed everybody at the fort. They then went to Fort Siebert the next day, and they killed a number of people. But there were some people that lived through it, so then they knew who did the attack. Well, in this particular fort, my fifth great grandfather by the name of John Hutchison, who was a Scottish immigrant, he was there at the fort and was killed. And fortunately for me, he had his daughter, my fourth great grandmother, and she married my fourth great grandfather, and here I am. So you get to thinking about all the things that happened, and one little thing that changed, and I wouldn't be here. So this happens to be one of them. Next slide. So just a little bit about the Battle of Point Pleasant. The British were trying to convince the Shawnee to go after the Americans and push them out of Kentucky and out of Ohio. And Kentucky was their hunting grounds. Ohio was where they lived, and the Americans were converging and encroaching on their land. And so he attacked American forces at Point Pleasant, and there are about 1,000 Shawnee Mingo warriors. During the battle, which was hand-to-hand combat, a lot of it was pretty brutal. It lasted all day long. There was a point when Cornstalk thought there was fresh troops coming in, some reinforcements, and he decided that they weren't going to be able to handle that, so they decided to go back across the river, and they went to Chillicothe. He talked to his men at Chillicothe and said, you know, if we continue to fight, we might as well kill all of our women and children and fight to the death, because we can't beat the Americans. So this was the point when he realized that the Shawnee could not win any battles anymore with the Americans. So he made a peace treaty with Lord Dunmore at Camp Charlotte, and they officially gave up Kentucky, and they gave up the Ohio River. They had been killing people that were going up and down the Ohio River on boats, and part of the treaty was they said they would quit doing that. So they became peaceful at the time. And this has been talked about as being the first battle of the American Revolution by some people, because they felt like the British instigated this, and it was more of in their minds, a British attack on the Americans than it was the Shawnee. In the upper left portion of that picture, those are actual artifacts that were taken from Shawnee warriors that had been in a family of the man that picked this stuff up. Every time they had a battle, they would go pick up all the stuff they could find. And this has been in this Captain Philip Love's family for 250 years, and have been recently for sale. And so my wife and I have been picking up what we can. So I've got this and a few other artifacts. Next slide. So Silver Heels, my great grandfather, he was, when Logan's family was killed at Yellow Creek, Logan went on the warpath. He took a bunch of Mingo and Shawnee men, and they started attacking settlers on the frontier. And he was on his way to Chillicothe, where Cornstalk had a number of traders that were Richard Butler's traders. They were there doing business, and he wouldn't allow Logan to come kill them. He was not not a fan of that retribution. He felt bad about Logan's family, but he wouldn't let this happen. So he got Silverheels to escort these people back to Fort Pitt. When he got to Fort Pitt and started on his way home, the commandant at Fort Pitt decided that he wanted to kill them on their way home. So he sent some men out there to ambush them, and Silverheels was shot in the chest. It was a really bad wound, went through a lung, and the party that was with him were able to get him down to Moravian town at Schönbrunn, and the John Heckwelder, who looked at him, the missionary there, said he couldn't help him. And so Silverheels wanted to go on down to Wakatamika, where he knew there were some Shawnee medicine men down there, and he got down to Wakatamika, and they patched him up somehow. Heckwelder said that there's no way that Silverheels was going to live, but he did, and he lived for a good number of years. Also, at the end of the Northwest Indian Wars, Silverheels was murdered in Stockport, Ohio, and he had been bragging to some men, this was after the war, that he'd killed a man near Beverly, Ohio, which is near Stockport. And when he was telling them this, it turned out that the man's son was standing there listening to the story, and Silverheels told him that he'd gotten the man's gun and stuck it in a tree, and he didn't need it. It was a musket. And so the son went back and looked, and he found that musket and realized Silverheels was telling the truth. So he went back a couple of weeks later and killed Silverheels in his camp there. Next slide. And the Nonhelema was their sister. She was called the Grenadier Squaw. She was 6 feet 6 inches tall, and they called her Grenadier because she was as tall as the Grenadier soldiers who had really tall hats. And she was a interpreter, and she made trade goods at Fort Pitt. She lived there for a long time. She had children with Richard Butler, who was an Irish trader and gunsmith at Fort Pitt. He became a American, I don't know if it was general, but something like that. And then she also had children with Alexander McKee. He was half Shawnee and half British, and he was a fur trader at Fort Pitt. And she and her mother converted to Christianity, and so she ended up becoming a peacemaker, and she was with Cornstalk in that era of when he was killed, trying to keep peace. And when she did that, the tribe kind of disowned her because she was helping the Americans, and they didn't like that, and so she just died penniless somewhere along the Pickaway Plains. Next slide. This is a later attack after, this was during the Revolution, and British regulars and Shawnee warriors attacked this Ruddles Fort, which is north of Lexington on the Licking River. This was the first time that cannons had been used in the frontier. This Captain Henry Byrd brought some cannons with him, and he blew a couple of holes in the wall of the fort. Generally, a fort like this, when the Indians attacked it, they really couldn't penetrate it. But with the cannons, it changed the whole thing. So the commandant, his name was Isaac Ruddle, he made a deal with Captain Byrd that if they let them in, that they wouldn't be killed. And so he said, yes, that's the case. Well, Captain Byrd, they opened the gates, and the Indians went in and they killed about 20 people just right off the bat. They took a number of captives, and then they were getting ready to go to another fort the next day. And actually they did, but Captain Byrd wouldn't let them do any more harm like this. He was not too happy with that. After the initial fighting, Captain Byrd and the troops and some of the Indians marched 400 people from Lexington to Detroit along what they call Byrd's War Road, and there were a number of them died and all that. But they ended up staying in Detroit for nearly 2 years as basically prisoners of war. Well, the funny thing about this is that Isaac Ruddle's wife was my first cousin. Her name was Elizabeth Bowman, and she was the first cousin to my fifth great grandfather named Cornelius Bowman. And I bumped into this on a DNA match to someone who was related to the Ruddles. And I got to looking at it, and I thought, what? Because I knew about Stephen Ruddle, who was a captive that grew up with Tecumseh, and he lived with Tecumseh for about 15 years and fought against the Americans. And so this, I wouldn't have known it, but this DNA match showed that. And then I started doing the research and realized that they were cousins. They all came from Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. But so that was a kind of an odd find that I had a few years ago. Next slide. And so some of the other involvement that my European family had with the Shawnee, against the Shawnee, of course, John Hutchison was the one that was killed at Fort Upper Tract. Well, Abner Lee, who was my third great grandfather, he was in the Revolution, and then he helped fight Cherokee down in North Carolina. And one interesting thing he said on his pension application was that he was drafted to fight with General St. Clair in 1791 against the Shawnee and the Miami up in northern Ohio. Well, he didn't go. He paid somebody to take his place, which was something you could do in those days, and he didn't go. Well, it turned out that St. Clair was defeated. He attacked, actually, the Shawnee and Miami attacked him, and at Fort Recovery, and they decimated St. Clair's army. It was the worst defeat of an American military ever, even to this day. And they killed about 90% of the men. So Abner might have been killed in that battle had he gone. And Colonel John Bowman was Elizabeth Bowman's brother. She had four brothers, and they all were in the Virginia militia, and they fought with George Rogers Clark against the Shawnee during this time period. John Bowman attacked the Shawnee town of Chillicothe and burned it to the ground and killed Chief Blackfish at that time. And then, of course, Elizabeth Bowman was at Ruddle's Fort. The Bowmans, when they finished fighting, built a distillery, and that distillery is still in existence, and you can still buy Bowman Brothers whiskey from Virginia. And so I got a few bottles of that, even though I don't bother drinking. And so that's some of the crazy things I found about my family.
And Jim, I think you found out a lot about this later in life. You just continually learned more about these ties, though, later in life. Is that
absolutely? That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's taken a long time to learn it.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing all of that. If you've joined us late, we apologize. We've been having some technical challenges, but we appreciate all of you who have joined us here. Next, we're going to pivot over to Tammi Shrum, who is joining us from Tuscarawas County, to talk a little bit. We've been talking an awful lot about the violence that was happening in and around the Ohio country at this time, 1750s, 1760s. There were squatters coming in, disrupting the Ohio country. Things in the East eventually were affecting things in the West. And so, Tammi, could we ask you to shed some light on this from your perspective? Tammi, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ohio country was a vast, fertile region that was west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River. A lot of what we call the Ohio country is what is the state of Ohio today, but some of it, stretches in a little bit different direction too. This land was rich in resources, and it was strategically located, and it became a pressure point between the American Indian nations, European empires, and the American settlers. Throughout the mid to late 1700s, a series of conflicts emerged here, driven by land disputes, military campaigns, and the ongoing tug-of-war of control. One of the earliest and most persistent sources of conflict was the arrival of squatters. settlers, often of European descent, who illegally moved to the Ohio country despite treaties that designated the land for American Indian nations. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the British issued the Royal Proclamation line, which was meant to limit westward expansion with no British settlement past the Allegheny Mountains. But the settlers continued to push west into lands occupied by the tribes such as the Shawnee, Lenape, Miami, and Mingo. These squatters weren't just farmers looking for opportunity. Their presence violated diplomatic agreements, provoked violence, and destabilized relations between Native nations and colonial governments. But the squatters were not the only ones entering the territory. You also had traders and missionaries, such as the Moravian missionaries who founded Shumbrun, Salem, Litchnow, Anjani, and Hutton. So in response to ongoing tensions and uprising, the British military launched several expeditions into the Ohio country, including Pontiac's War, which was a defensive war led by the Ottawa. It included a confederation of American Indians against the British government. So we'll go to the next slide. So one of the most significant British movements into the Ohio country was Colonel Henry Bouquet's expedition in 1764. Bouquet was a Swiss-born officer in the British Army, and he followed the Great Trail through the Ohio wilderness to try to force peace with allegedly hostile tribes. And this is a map, a very stylized map of the route that Bouquet took through the Ohio country. It's very stylized at the bottom, but if you look at the top, it really kind of follows what they called the Muskingum River, with the modern Tuscarawas County River. So that's the top line there, shows their route along the Great Trail and along the Tuscarawas River. So Bouquet left several camps along the Tuscarawas River, and he built a modern-day blockhouse in Bolivar. His mission was to conduct peace negotiations between the American Indians and between the British government, asking for captives to be returned to their British families. Originally, they were going to hold this peace conference at the blockhouse that they built in Bolivar, but later they decided to move that down to Coshocton near what is today Roscoe Village. But rather than simply fighting in his campaign, Bouquet was strategic and diplomatic about it, or he tried to be, and he used peaceful, tactful negotiations to obtain those prisoners, and he was able to take many of them back to British territory. However, after he got them to Fort Pitt, a lot of them did go back to their American Indian families that they had been forced to leave behind. So now we're going to fast forward about a decade to the American Revolution. And we'll go to the next slide. Oh, there's Bouquet and his negotiations. So go ahead to the next slide after that one too. So we're going to fast forward to the American Revolution. And a lot of people think American Revolution happens on the East Coast, but there's a lot of action that happens in the West too. And the Ohio country once again became a battleground. American Indian nations, who largely sided with the British, hoped to halt the advancement of those American settlers. In 1778, the Treaty of Fort Pitt was signed. This was the first treaty signed between the new United States government and an American Indian tribe. The Lenape agreed to allow the U.S. to build a fort on their land and to help protect their people. As a part of that treaty, and to fulfill an expedition to attack Fort Detroit, the Continental Army built Fort Lawrence outside of modern-day Bolivar on the same grounds that Henry Bouquet had built his blockhouse about a decade earlier. The fort was to be used as a base for launching attacks against British-aligned American Indian groups. Located along the Tuscarawas River, Fort Lawrence was strategically important but poorly supplied and vulnerable. The winter was brutal, and in early 1779, the fort came under siege by American Indian forces allied with the British, including Simon Girty and Captain Henry Byrd. The garrison suffered from starvation, disease, and low morale. At one point, they were said to have boiled their moccasins just to survive. Though the siege was lifted, the Americans eventually abandoned the fort, a clear sign of the immense difficulty in holding territory so deep in contested land. The conflicts in the Ohio country were driven by a collision of interest, settlers eager for land, American Indian nations fighting to protect their homelands, and empires and governments seeking strategic control. From the illegal squatting that sparked local violence to Bouquet's calculated military diplomacy to the doom stand at Fort Lawrence, each episode reflects the broader struggle over the future of the American frontier. The Ohio country wasn't just a backdrop for conflict, it was the front line for a centuries-long battle over land, identity, and survival. What we have talked about this evening is just the tip of the iceberg of this vast story. So there are many great historic sites across the state of Ohio that I recommend you go and visit just to help you get a better understanding of the story.
Thank you, Tammi. You know, I've sometimes in this role thought about the spirit of 76, which was discussed a lot in 1976. And as it turns out, we have 76 state parks and we have 76 National Historic Landmarks. So my favorite number is 250, but my second favorite number is 76.
76.
So
good.
Thanks for covering ground there. You know, I've been struck, we've talked a couple of times about the importance of the specific year of 1763 was a pivotal one for at least three reasons. Something that came to be known as Pontiac's War occurred that year. The Treaty of Paris ending the French and Indian War was signed, and the issuing of the Royal Proclamation that Tammi mentioned in 1763. So I think Jim also touched on this. So Jim or anyone else, do you want to talk a little bit more about 1763 and the significance of that in the aftermath of the French and Indian War?
You know, the thing
Brandon?
about this was that the Shawnee didn't recognize, they were not recognized, they were not a part of the treaty between France and England. And so when it came to out, they were told, you don't own this land anymore, Great Britain owns it. And they said, well, we didn't have anything to do with that. So that continued to be a sore spot for the Shawnee, of course, from then on. And obviously they went to war later, but the treaty was between, you know, France and England, and it was, the Shawnee didn't have anything to do with it. They were pretty mad about it.
Brandon,
I
any?
feel too.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like the proclamation line. I mean, as soon as they put that in place, everyone just started breaking it. There was some drive to just move out west. Even George Washington sent some surveyors out there to see if there was any land that he, you know, might want to obtain himself. So you don't really see it in this map, but a lot of the colonies kind of claimed all the land west of them straight across the United States as far as they could even imagine. So George Washington wanted a piece of Virginia that was past that proclamation line.
Right. And I think that looking at kind of where I started my presentation with like the seeds of the 7 Years' War, I think in a lot of cases, the way that I teach my classes is that the proclamation is the seeds of the Revolutionary War. So although I think a lot of historians and even Jim himself, you know, we have different starting points of where this occurs, but in general, it's around this time period. And significantly, it's not in Boston. It's not in New York City. It's not in Philadelphia. It's in the Ohio country. It's here. This is where it happened. And in the proclamation line, as Tammi has already pointed out, that no one obeyed it, and the English could not defend it. I know a question I always ask my students is, from Marietta to Pittsburgh, how many soldiers would you need to stop people from crossing a line that connects Marietta to Pittsburgh, which is about a 2.5 hour drive? And they're like 100,000, 200,000, 1 million, sometimes they say. I'm like saying that's like this much of the proclamation line. how many millions of soldiers would you need on that line to prevent squatters and land speculators and surveyors and missionaries from crossing that line? So although there had been circumstances earlier than this that demonstrate colonial resistance to British authority, if you think about throwing the tea in the Boston Harbor, this was a severe violation because you were taking English material goods and destroying it. You know, you're disobeying British authority. Well, you can say the same thing about the Proclamation line. This was an open display of just ignoring British authority, like openly doing it. And why I say openly is because the British would march up and down the Proclamation line, burn cabins. They would come back, and there would be twice as many. So there was nothing there to stop them. They were coming no matter what Britain did. But I think if we think on a larger scale too, when we're, you know, one leads into the other, the Treaty of Paris, which Jim mentioned, the Shawnee were not part of. Well, no native nation was part of that. The British said North America is now conquered. It belongs to the British, and so British officials are now representing not only Americans but also Native Americans. And so no Native people, even though they are victors in this war, had no table at the conference. That was what leads into Pontiac's War as austerity takes place because of the cost of war. The Proclamation line was there to separate because Pontiac's War was so devastating and so costly that the British tried to put an artificial line on there that says neither side can cross that because Indian War is expensive and we can never win that. That's an impossible war to win. And so, you know, when you start to think about that dynamic of British losing control in the periphery of their empire, that's where it begins to crumble. That's where we see resolves and resolutions coming out that are very bold, right? They're saying, yes, we're loyal to the king, but we only do that if you're going to be fair, and you're not being fair. And so they don't say it explicitly, but you can very much read between the lines that the Americans were more than willing to defend their rights, at least along the frontier, maybe even more so than in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, which I think, I don't know if you want to give someone else a chance to talk, but if you look at the next slide, you're going to see that there's a lot of equality here. We give so much attention to the East Coast when really where this all begins is in the Ohio country. So I don't know if Jim or Tammy want to expand on that, but if you look at that timeline, you have, you know, the Stamp Act, you have the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, you have the you know, Boston Massacre, you have the throwing of the tea in the harbor, but equally on the other side, you also have events in the Ohio Valley that are equally, if not more important, because you have to ask a simple question. Which was more important to George Washington, taxes on tea or his land in the Ohio country? Mm-hmm. I'm going to say land in the Ohio country. That was way more. So how do you connect Eastern traders, Eastern merchants to Western landowners? You know, there has to be something that connects them together. And that's, you know, for Washington and Jefferson and even Benjamin Franklin, right? Their land interests in the Ohio country is what leads them to join this rebellion with Eastern merchants. Otherwise, how do you connect the two?
Mm-hmm. Well said, Brandon.
Thanks.
You know, I think about, you know, I'll bet a lot of you know that the documentary by Ken Burns and others is coming out in mid-November. It'll be on PBS called The American Revolution. We'll be covering a lot of this similar ground. As we think about entering the 250th anniversary of the United States as an independent nation, governed initially, you know, by a loose confederation of states with different priorities, later by a national government governed by the consent of the people, it can sometimes feel really distant for average Ohioans, you know, just to relate to a lot of this. Yet we've established that the Ohio country was not some unknown, irrelevant place. In fact, the push for American independence in the East increasingly affected what was happening in the western areas closer to the Ohio country, where Native people had lived and hunted for generations. We've talked a lot about that this evening. Our next episode in November will specifically discuss the American Revolution in that period. But before we take a few questions from our audience, I think this was touched on briefly earlier about Lord Dunmore's War and something today known as the Fort Gower Resolves. That puts us right onto the edge of armed conflict between colonists and British redcoats. Can someone tell us a little bit about Lord Dunmore's War and who was Lord Dunmore anyway? Brandon, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, he was popular, then he wasn't popular. So I guess that's how politics works nowadays. But yeah, so he was, so, we can look at Lord Dunmore, but I think that if we look at the bigger picture here is the British unable to understand the larger idea of empire, right? This is the empire they gained in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, doubled the size of their empire. And they did not have the infrastructure to maintain it. And I think in the Ohio country is a perfect example of this. And, focusing on Lord Dunmore is that up until the 7 Years' War, up until the French and Indian War, Indian policy was controlled by the individual colonies. So it was not uniform across the frontier. And then what happened during the French and Indian War, and especially after the war, in 1763, is Pontiac's War, is that Britain now wants to take control of Indian affairs because they're like, the colonists, you can't trust the colonists. They're not doing the right thing. So the British are going to take control of it. And so they establish a Department of Indian Affairs, a Northern Department and a Southern Department. Probably Sir William Johnson is the famous character here that becomes the Northern Department superintendent, and Stewart becomes the Southern, mostly dealing with the Cherokee. But why is this significant? How does this tie in? Well, what happens is George Crone and Sir William Johnson are going to advocate for more money, more control over Indian affairs, and the British are kind of reluctant to give it to them. In fact, they wait almost a decade for policy to come forth from the British, which never comes, by the way. In fact, what the British do, they decide it's too expensive. And what they do is they relinquish control back, right? So you're 1763. When's Lord Dunmore's War? A decade later, they give control back to the states, and that's when Dunmore strikes. Once Indian policy was back in colonial control, is the exact moment that Lord Dunmore strikes to put the Shawnee kind of back into their place, right? To remove them from lands that Virginians had claimed to. And that leads, of course, to the Fort Gower Resolves, which is very, the soldiers who fought in that conflict, very emboldened by their victory, and along with many of the other resolves that were taking place at this time against British policy, claiming that, we're loyal to the king, but, we're only going to accept so much. And where the Fort Gower Resolves is different is they actually threaten resistance, violence, defense of their rights in writing. So that's what makes it kind of stand apart maybe from the many other resolves that were occurring all across Western Pennsylvania and Western Virginia. So that's who Lord Dunmore was.
Yeah, and Fort Gower was just a short-term fort there on the edge of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Am I right about that, Brandon?
Yeah, a lot of these, luckily we have Fort Lawrence, which is well, preserved, but a lot of these are just temporary. Many of them are actually stockades, right, or even houses that are just fortified, so they don't have a long lifespan. Most of them. There's some that survive, but yeah.
Very good. Well, we have gone a little bit over time because of some of our technical issues, but we'll be happy to take a couple questions from audience members. If you want to just go ahead and put that in the chat. And Chris, can you feed us some questions or one or two before we wrap up tonight?
Happy to help. You can also raise your hand. I think you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or come on camera. And I also can see the chat if somebody wants to ask a question there. I guess I have a question while we're waiting for some guest questions, and that is, a lot of this is still very new to me, even though I'm a lifelong Ohioan. Maybe I fell asleep during history when I was younger, but I love it now. And so, is there, I guess, would there be something that you all would recommend as a good understanding of this time period, as like a book that would be, uh, good, but also accessible for the average non-historian friend like me?
Well, most of my books are academic, so that's probably
Well,
I mean, that's what we use in the classroom. So, yeah, I mean, there are, there was, if you're interested in a recent book that I just actually read and just came out is the Fort Stanwix Treaty.
Okay, Speculators and Empire.
Empire. Yeah, it's not a difficult read, but it's really insightful in terms of like the bigger picture in terms of empire and like what's going on the local level and how that comes into conflict. And it's centered on the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which was a turning point. 1768, we're on the verge of revolution here. So if you're really interested in this comes after the Proclamation line, and when they try to redraw the line because of colonial pressure, was Fort Stanwix, and so they redraw the line. That's where West Virginia and Kentucky basically are lost because of the Fort Stanwix treaty line. So it's a relatively new book, and it's easy to get through. There's some older books too. Yeah, an older book. This one, great historian, great author, Country Between, by McConnell. It's an older book, but it's still very relevant. It's still very usable in today's larger picture of things. These are just sitting on my desk right now. So.
And then I would say Settling Ohio, First Peoples and Beyond, is edited by Timothy Anderson and Brian Schoen. I think that's a good one. And there is a small anthology of Fort Lawrence by Thomas Pieper that if you want that specific part of the Revolution, I think it's good. And you can also get copies of Henry Bouquet's his orderlies and the whole journals that they kept on the expedition. It's a heavy read, but you can go through it, and it's pretty neat to read the actual entries from the army as they were going on the expedition.
And Bouquet's a very fascinating person too, so I think that people would find him very interesting. Bushy Run, right? The Battle of Bushy Run. He was part of that, so he's a very interesting character. So that might be a good read.
Yeah. I can have you guys maybe send us and we can share with everybody because some of my spelling is going to be wrong. We do have a question from the audience, and that is, what about the smaller tribes that fought in the war?
The broad question. I don't like, so the only other, so my research area is the Delaware, Jim's is the Shawnee. So those were two of the most important ones in the 7 Years' War, at least in the Ohio country. Of course, the Iroquois played a major role there too, but there you can find lots of books and writings on the Iroquois. That's probably the most written about. Them and the Cherokee are probably the two most written about Native peoples on this side of the continent. So smaller group, Mingos are involved. The Mingos, that's a kind of an interesting story. The Mingos are Iroquois, but they're like outside Iroquois people, and they're kind of in between. Like they don't know who to join. Should they join the Delaware and the Shawnee? The Delaware and Shawnee, by the way, are very, very close friends for the most part. They lived amongst each other pretty frequently and pretty regularly. And then the Mingos were kind of just north of that, and then the Iroquois above that. So there's a lot of intertribal dealings here that have a great impact on. Do you join the British? Do you join the Americans? Right. And really the Revolutionary War is what tears all those alliances apart. So smaller groups further in Ohio. Yeah, that's not a question I probably could address competently, but I don't know, Tammi or Jim maybe.
Are we allowed to talk on here?
Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Stephanie. I am the curator for the Geauga County Historical Society, and we are currently researching a tribe called the Massasaugas that were on the Cuyahoga River. Now, from what I'm reading, they're part of the Ojibwe tribe, and I know that the Ojibwe tribe allied with the French during the 7 Years' War instead of the British. So I was, because these smaller tribes, they're not in existence today anymore. And so, because, how records are and all of that. But, I was just wondering if you guys have come across any of like the smaller tribes that aren't in existence that actually fought in the French and Indian War.
Wasn't the Ojibways, aren't they also called the Huron? Aren't they the same people?
Chippewa.
Chippewa. Okay, Chippewa.
The Wyandots are Hurons.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. You're right. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
The Ojibways,
I don't know why that came in my mind.
The Ojibways are a pretty big tribe, especially now. I had one of my great grandmothers, I think, was a Ojibwe, according to the DNA studies that we've done. They have a very rare haplogroup, which was really interesting. But I haven't run across a whole lot or researched a lot about the smaller tribes, mainly because I've got my hands full with just taking care of the Shawnee.
Jim, maybe you can explain like maybe the ways that you've done your, maybe we can't help her out specifically in terms of like identifying those tribes, but maybe you can kind of describe how you've gone about your research. Because it seems like you found some like really interesting things through various ways, and maybe they could emulate some of the ways that you do your research and maybe find out things that they're looking for. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit, do you think?
Well, like I said, I got lucky that my family was very prominent and they were listed in the records. If you were say a Barnes, you might not have a clue who your relatives were past before, say, 1850, 1830. When you get back that far, you end up with Indian names that they don't mean anything. You can't translate them. And unless you know who they were, if they had an English name, then you might know who they were. And at some point, they switch from an Indian name to an English name. And if you don't have that, basically a cheat sheet, they're just going to get lost as far as individuals go. It's tough. I just got lucky. If I'd been a Barnes, I might not have found anything.
Yeah, and the other problem is too is that there's no, the way they spell names from one source to the next, even though it's the same person, it's completely spelled differently. So even if you did like a search,
right,
like you might just pass over it just simply because of the spelling of it. So I mean that complicates things too in a lot of ways.
That's right. My cousin out in California has had a bunch of stuff translated from the Moravian archives and things that had not been translated before, and she has to find out if that name that they wrote is the same name that you see in the history books, and she'll call me and it probably is, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, it's tough.
Thank you, gentlemen, for elaborating a little bit more on that for me.
Yeah, sorry I couldn't help you more.
That's okay.
Right, very good. Any final questions here? Thanks everyone for sticking around a little later than expected. We appreciate that. Thanks everyone, and we will have our our next Ohio in the Revolution episode will be in November. And let's see if we can get that last slide up. I think it might be November 13th.
I thought I was sharing. Hold on just a second.
Okay.
I'll try again. All right, can you see it now?
There it is. Okay.
All right.
All right. Yeah, November 13th, and the revolution begins. So we will get into that, and hopefully we're going to have an episode that doesn't have tech issues. So thanks, Chris, for helping navigate all the challenges, and for all of you who stayed patient with us. We greatly appreciate it. Many thanks to our three panelists, Brandon, Tammy, and Jim. Jim's joining us all the way from Oklahoma. And so we greatly appreciate all of your input. Thanks everyone for joining us. And if we don't see you before, we hope to see you November 13th. Have a great evening. Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Appreciate it. Now,
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.